Smarter Markets is back here at CERAWeek, and I'm joined by our friend Jeff Currie, Chief Strategy Officer of Energy Pathways at Carlyle. How are you doing, Jeff?
I'm doing well.
It's a good time to talk because it's a bad situation in the world. We have the conflict in Iran, obviously first and foremost in many people's minds in the energy markets. Can you put this into context? What's happening now?
Well, it's definitely one of the largest shocks. In fact, it is the largest shock the oil markets have ever seen in their history. And just to quote, Fatih Birol, who put it as the combination of 73 and 79 put together, which I think is an appropriate assessment. But let's think about it and put it in the context of COVID. COVID, I would argue, is more appropriate analogy. That was a 20 million barrel per day demand collapse. Here, it's a 20 million barrel per day supply collapse. Now, let's think about what it took to rebalance the market during COVID. So you had, supply up here and demand there, and then demand came down here. Once you filled up all the storage tanks, meaning that you were lending barrels to the future and you couldn't lend anymore, what happened? Boom, you had to crush demand down in line with, or supply down in line with demand. Let's recall, what kind of prices did that take? Minus $37 a barrel to do it. So now we're doing the reverse, where you have supply down here, demand is up here. Eventually, once we exhaust our ability to draw down inventories, which we think is somewhere mid to late April, what has to happen? Demand has to come crashing down in line with supply. And the key question you have to ask is, how high do you have to go? Because I think, we put a piece out, you can't print molecules. There's nothing you can do. Once you've exhausted the inventories at that gap, you have to force that alignment. And I think that's the key question.
And you say we have maybe till mid to late April. And even as much as energy prices have gone up, they haven't gone up to that extent. And so it reminds me of that old Hemingway quote, I think, of how do you go bankrupt? Slowly, then all at once. Yep. Are we in a slowly, then all at once scenario? And how do you frame this? How are you, putting a framework around what's going to happen next?
Yeah, I think what we've priced in is, the old saying, buy the rumor, sell the fact. Well, we've priced in the rumor. And that's how we got up to where, $95, $100 a barrel in WTI and Brent right now. I think most people think the highs were behind us and that you sell the fact when you get the piece. No, that's not how commodity markets work. Commodity markets are not anticipatory assets. They're spot assets. I think, Gabe, you invented that terminology at Goldman way back when. And so they don't price the future, they price the now. And the supply and demand the price has to clear supply and demand today. We're not in a shortage today. We're going to be a shortage mid-April. That's when the market has to clear. And so if anyone, I think, buy the rumor and really buy the fact here, because that's when it's going to become quite explosive, is when you have to actually clear the market. And when I think about the framework, think about you have this buffer between when the disruption happened and when you run out of inventories. At the beginning, let's just use the big oil glut, the biggest numbers. Let's say 800 million to, a billion barrels of oil that was built up. That's about as much as you could realistically say. We put it around 800. You take the disruption. This month, you're going to lose somewhere even with the SPR, you're going to lose 440 to 450 million barrels. That's almost half of it right there. A little more than half of it. So by the time you move into April, it won't take long before you've exhausted and you're at tank bottoms. Watch out the SPRs. There's not a lot of left. Integrity of the caves, the caverns will be stressed. So by the time we get to the middle or the end of April, we start to have a real serious problem. And I think that's when you can potentially see prices really begin to spike.
And people who don't stay as close to the energy markets as you do may not have noticed yet, just by looking at the TI price or the Brent price, the stresses that are already in the system. You see $200 jet fuel in Asia, regional crudes well over 100. Where are you starting to see some of the stress form?
I think you pinpointed it's in Asia because it's the closest transportation to that. And when you think about what's going on, like diesel, like down in Australia, it's to the point they're having to shut mines down. The shortages. Why? Because they took a lot of the diesel out of the China market, and China has export controls on it. So you've already impacted that world. You have Thailand export controls. This is hoarding. That's the big question. And it's impacting the Philippines already. So that part of the world, you're already seeing it. And the spreads between the financial and physicals are, at record levels. And I think that really, pinpoints, ABIX is in a really unique position to be able to take advantage of these differentials that are, at record levels. And so when we look at what's likely to happen is those differentials that are sitting in Asia right now. Now let's do the transportation time to Rotterdam. About 4 weeks. When does 4 weeks come? Probably about next week. And that's when you can probably see, prices trading substantially. Oman Brent, they hit like 191, or Oman in Dubai, they spiked to $191 a barrel last week. Yeah, they've collapsed into that 120 range. It has something to do, with the contract integrity. But also, I do believe if you take the average, they're trading around 20 plus, dated Brent, which puts it in that 125 range. So, prices are much higher there. Now, I would argue this molecular contagion spreads to Europe sometime in the next, week or two. Now, the last place a little bit is, we're here in Texas right now. It'll be the last place that it hits.
And in addition to regional contagion, this is also much more than the oil market, right? We've got the natural gas market through the LNG shut-ins. In Qatar, we've got ammonia shortages. Like, how widespread is this across the whole complex?
By the way, it's 8% of global trade. And let's not forget about what goes in. I mean, everybody's focused on what comes out, but you need the bauxite to go in, to go to like the Alba smelters to produce the aluminum that gets sent back out. So that the implications are widespread. So it's hitting the base complex, the food complex, the energies, plastics, the list goes on. And I think a key point here is, I like to say, no good deed goes unpunished. All of those efficiency gains we've made over the last 50 years really begin to create a critical use of oil demand. So when you pull that barrel out of the global economy, it's going to have a much larger impact on growth than what you would see if it were just price. And all these economic models are all built around availability of supply at some price. We're going to be pricing absence. That's a whole different ballgame. And I think the key issue is there's a level of complacency. It doesn't appreciate that. And I think part of it is they can't feel it right now. They can't see it. By the way, that analogy to COVID, I remember it was late January of 2020. I go, second largest economy in the world just shut down. That's got to be bad. I remember we go, all right, let's start getting short oil at that point. But, I thought it would go down. And then, Europe is shutting down. Oh my God, America is shutting down. And it was like a contagion. It took 6 weeks to spread to the rest of the world. I think it's the same thing. You're watching the shortages happening like it's a slow motion train wreck in Asia. And then everybody's sitting over here. Yeah, it's not coming this direction.
No, and it takes me back to, I remember watching news reports from China, December of 2019, and you were seeing what they were having to go through, but it still had that air of unreality. And to a certain extent, I feel like we're the people on the beach as the water goes out before the tsunami. So we've got, 4 weeks for a resolution. How do we know if we're getting to one? And what do you think is going to drive whether we're able to resolve this over the next 4 weeks?
Yeah, I think the point is time is on Iran's side, and it works against the Americans. And hence why you see the Americans rushing to get a diplomatic channels of negotiation open, and the Iranians dragging their feet. Now, the Iranians don't want to drag the feet that they blow up the world, but there's going to be that give and take, and I think that's going to be critical over the next 4 to 5 weeks. If you get into May, it's pretty clear. All bets are off by that point in time. And again, this is something the world's never seen, as something of this magnitude. So I think the key point there is, I want to emphasize too that oil is flowing through the straits. You have the Chinese oil, the Indian oil, the Turkish oil. It's flowing through there. So this is selective. It's a two-tiered strait right now that the Iranians control, in that they don't want to shut it, because they shut it and then they lose their power. So they do want to keep it open to a certain degree, and they don't want to create too much global havoc. So But I think it's a race between the two parties about where that is. And that's why I think everybody says, oh, 3 to 4 weeks, because they know it goes past that, they got a really serious problem. But we'll see. Odds are, looking at the first round of negotiations, reading what the 15-point list of U.S. was and the 5-point list of Iran, they are really far apart. And we saw with, with the Ukrainian and Russians, those points take really hard to cross.
And these things can go on much longer than anyone ever thinks, right? If you look at Russia, Ukraine still going on.
Actually, somebody said the other day to me, I think it's probably right, it's going to go on a lot longer than what the average let's call it the complacent person that's watching this right now. And it'll probably go a lot faster than somebody who's close to it, like I'm thinking. So it's probably somewhere in between.
Okay. And so even if we avoid the terrible scenario of this not resolving and these major shortages hitting, sometime in April, it's still not a great picture if you're an energy consumer. So I wanted to ask you, how are you thinking about where do we go from here, under both scenarios?
I think no matter what, you have done permanent damage to global supply chains. I mean, everything. The boats are in the wrong places. They've dumped cargoes in other parts of the world. In fact, Costco this morning in China is going to dump stuff on land, try to truck it across. It's going to take months to get ships back into the right places. Then let's talk about the damage that you've done to the infrastructure. Ras Laffan, it's the largest LNG terminal in the world. It's going to take years to rebuild it. Damage at South Pars. The Iraqi fields are shut in. The Kuwaiti fields are shut in. You got 10 million barrels per day of fields are shut in. When we look at, my favorite investment right now are the drillers. Why? You're going to have to re-drill all of those wells in those. There are many cases, and you want to own the shallow water drills. And I'm on the board of bore. I'm a big fan of bore drilling, and I think that's probably one of the better ways to play it. But it's going to require a lot of oil services and maintenance to get this fixed. It's not going to happen like that. It's going to take months, if not years. And then let's look at the Red Sea as an example. The Red Sea, the Americans bombed the Houthis for 2 years. And where's production today? It's only recovered to it flows in the Red Sea half to where they were before. And most of that is Chinese, Indian, it's the same Turkish, it's the same flagged vessels. For lack of a better term, it's the BRICS versus the G7. And I wouldn't be surprised we see a similar dynamic here play out, where you have a significant loss there. You think about what happened in the 70s and the 80s. You ended up at one point losing somewhere around 8 million barrels per day of demand because you lost so much supply, and then it just leaves and goes and finds something else. And by the way, one thing that's different about this versus COVID is COVID was really bad for the developing countries and not bad for the emerging markets, because there we actually had to shut down real large activity. Think about an emerging market; it wasn't as difficult. Here, it's going to be the other way around. The developed markets. In fact, I think people here in Texas are probably going, "Currie, what are you talking about? Nothing ever happened." Yeah, you sit on top of all the shale production, probably nothing's going to feel it, but you're going to feel it in the emerging markets. And when we think about a permanent loss in demand, I say that COVID was great for China. This is even better for China, because coming out of COVID, Chinese manufacturing got 50% above U.S. and Europe. 50%. That's huge. And over that time period, and a lot of it's EVs. And what do you think all of those countries in those emerging markets are going to want? I can't afford the oil. EVs are looking pretty good. And China's like, hey, I can produce 50 million units of these things right now. So I'd say, those are some of the real permanent shifts. And I think lastly, bringing it to the new dual order, where we argued security is paramount, and that when we think about investment in energy, you've got to go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is fear, greed, and compassion. And if you get the rank ordering on those wrong, you end up with bad outcomes. You look at Germany; it put compassion above fear and greed, and it got caught short on everything. And by the way, it learned its lesson. If there's one group, in fact, they just turned a Volkswagen auto or factory into a missile factory. So they're retooling themselves fast. But why is this important? Maslow said, build a secure base. And that's what I think security is the most important. So the lasting effect of this is going to be to focus on creating a secure energy source. And I like to point out that France has the lowest carbon footprint in the world. It didn't get there because it wanted to save the planet. It got there because it wanted energy security. Charles de Gaulle, his biggest fear is exactly what's happening right now. So he built all those nuclear power plants to be able to create that security. And renewables and energy transition were born out of the energy crisis in 1973. They were not born out of the Paris Agreement in 2015 at all. They were created out of that. And so, if anything, what we're going to see is we're going to turbocharge the energy transition. And you go to those emerging markets, they're going to go, hey. Well, let's put a gas turbine up, some solar, some wind, maybe a nuclear reactor, and we're going to drive EVs. And I think that's a serious risk.
I'm going to get greedy and ask you one more question, Jeff, because you got me thinking. And you're always thinking about the overall impact on not just the commodities but the financial flows as well. And when you talk about the production that's being taken offline in the Middle East, it's a lot of dollars that aren't raised every day. There's going to be, as you said, a much bigger need for investment at home in restoring production facilities. You could have consumers who are oil dependent suddenly much, much poorer. Some pretty big wealth impacts could come out of this. How do you think about that potential impact?
Huge, and the market's discounting it. And I think it started in 2022 when the Americans and Europeans froze the central bank assets of Russia. Why? What did that happen? Because historically, before that event, oil prices would explode. The sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East would get a windfall. And what they do, take all that windfall, and it was like QE, it was credit that went off into Europe and the United States and softened the blow. And I remember looking at the oil price, it just collapsed after 2022. And I finally figured it out the other day. Why? Even though it was in backwardation coming down, right? It was the opposite. Remember, we were in contango going up and we were in backwardation. Why? You were sucking all that capital out. Why? They started buying gold. They go, I'm not going to invest in U.S. treasuries. If I'm going to get my assets frozen by the United States, I'm done. We're out of treasuries and we're into gold. Gold goes straight up. Oil starts to come down, and you start to see the pressure on the yields. And so I think we're in an environment now where not only do they not want to buy U.S. treasuries or European bonds, but they now don't even have the money to do it. So this is a contraction in global credit supply. So it's going to work the opposite way. And again, I don't think people are watching. I noticed it was the Chinese, I think it was CIC, who came out and goes, hey, we're going to go and provide, and it's before, they're thinking no possible way would you see the Chinese providing all this credit to global, but they're like, they've got the EVs, they've got the credit, I mean, and ultimately all those Middle East sovereign wealth funds were going to be behind financing that $700 billion of AI CapEx that needed to happen this year. They're not going to be there. And China's like, we'll be here. We'll see what happens on that. But I think you hit the nail on the head. I think the capital flows, one more point on the capital flows that's important. And this is where energy dominance fails. The paradox of energy dominance is when you look at the U.S. equity market, it's not energy dominant at all. 3% of the equity market is oil companies. It has a multiple of about 12. The stuff that's short is over 50%. Let's call it 30 trillion. So 2 trillion, 30 trillion. 30 trillion of it short with a multiple of like 36. So what do you think is going to happen? And here's another number. 41% of the U.S. equity market, those big Mag 7, get their earnings in energy short parts of the world. I don't know. I tend to look at the markets and I think they're underestimating the upside in the underlying commodity prices, and I think the rotation, call it, you and I created those the revenge of the old economy. Call it halo now. I love the term halo. Actually, somebody pointed out to me the concept of halo doesn't get the rotation in. But I think for those who don't know what halo, it's heavy asset, low obsolescence. But you want those kind of companies. We're going to see that. So what do you think is going to happen? That 2 trillion, the 30 trillion is probably going to do that. And if you saw $100 barrel oil on a long-term basis now, which is not inconceivable, you're looking at the valuation of those energy companies being the lowest they've printed since like the 2000s. So I think there's a lot of value in the heavy assets.
Well, thanks for making the time to catch up with us, Jeff. I know it's been a busy week for you. Always great to catch up, and thanks for putting everything that's happening in context.
Excellent. Thanks, Dave. Good seeing you.